Hello NAC TV viewers, and welcome to our first discussion about POPI, which is all about the protection of our personal information at our church. We live in a digital world and need to make sure that our information is kept safe. The POPI Act came into effect on the 1st of July 2020 and will become fully enforceable by the 1st of July 2021. To help us understand the POPI Act better, we invited Chloe Loubser, Senior Associate at Bowman's Law Firm, into the studio. Welcome to our studio, Chloe.
Thanks, Neville. It's good to be here.
What is the protection of personal information all about?
Well, Neville, in a nutshell, the Protection of Personal Information Act, which you will often be heard being referred to as the POPI Act or POPIA, essentially has been promulgated to give effect to our constitutional right to privacy, and it regulates the processing of personal information of data subjects by responsible parties. Now, if we break those terms up a little bit, the data subject is any natural person like you and me, or it can be a juristic person like a company. And the data subject is the person to whom the personal information relates. The responsible party, on the other hand, is the person or body who determines why and how the processing of our personal information will happen. And what POPIA seeks to do is to regulate in what circumstances and how responsible parties are able to process our personal information. And it does that by putting in place certain requirements or conditions, which we call the 8 conditions for lawful processing, which responsible parties are required to comply with whenever they process our information.
Chloe, what do you mean by processing?
Well, processing is a very widely defined concept, and essentially it means anything that you can do with personal information. So it will be the collection of our information, the receipt, storage, distribution, can even be the destruction or deletion of information.
Once POPIA is fully enforced, will it make it more difficult for people to use and disseminate my private information?
Potentially yes, but before I answer your question, I just want to stop you. It is very important for us to understand that this doesn't only apply to private information or confidential information. It applies to our personal information, which is actually a broader concept. And that will even include publicly available information. So a person's name or contact details that you can find on a website or in a telephone directory, that might not be private, but it does constitute personal information. Then when we're talking about POPIA, what we're also talking about is only information that is contained in a record. So, for example, if I were to talk to my colleague and say that, do you know, another one of our colleagues is pregnant? That's actually processing that colleague's personal information. But because I'm just saying this verbally and it's not contained in any record, POPIA wouldn't apply. But if I was in the workplace and I told that to the Human Resources Department and HR then made a note in that employee's personnel file, now that information would be in a record and POPIA would then apply. And when we're talking about a record, another thing to bear in mind is that this doesn't only apply to anything that's in writing, in written form. It can be in any medium. So it could even be video footage, so CCTV camera footage. It could be a photograph or anything that's logged in computer equipment. But going back to your question about whether POPIA will make it more difficult for people to use or disseminate your information, it won't necessarily make it more difficult per se, but what the responsible party will need to do is make sure that it complies with the 8 conditions for lawful processing, and there will now be a mechanism to hold that responsible party accountable. So, for example, the responsible party will need to make sure that there's always a specific purpose for processing the information, that data subjects are made aware of what that purpose is, that there is a justifiable ground upon which you may base that processing, and also that there are appropriate security safeguards in place to prevent any unlawful access to that information.
Yeah, you said that responsible parties will be held accountable if they don't process information lawfully. What do you mean by that?
So another thing that POPI does, it establishes the information regulator. And this is the regulatory body that essentially can monitor and enforce compliance with the Act. So if you think about, you could report a crime to SAPS, for example. In the same way, you could report non-compliance with POPI to the information regulator.
Thanks, Chloe. I think that provides quite a good general overview on what POPI is all about. But what I'd like you to explain is, and to our viewers and to our congregation, is how POPI applies to the church.
So in our context, the church will itself be a responsible party. Because if you think about it, there is a lot of personal information that the church holds about many people, about its members. You know, when a member joins your church, you may then take down their contact details, their birthday, for example. You also hold a lot of information about your employees and ministers, and all of those people would be data subjects under POPI.
And as data subjects, our members, employers and ministers all have certain rights, don't they?
Yes, they do, Neville. So all data subjects under POPI have certain rights. So, for example, they have the right to be notified whenever their personal information is being collected. They also have a right to be notified if there's been unlawful access to their information. So, for example, if there's been a data breach. They also have rights to request access to their information. So they could come to the church and ask to confirm that you do hold certain information about them. They could ask you to correct information that is perhaps incorrect or out of date. And in certain circumstances, they can also ask you to delete certain information that you keep. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, with the information regulator, data subjects also have a right to lay a complaint to the information regulator if they believe that their information has been processed unlawfully.
I haven't heard you saying at any point that data subjects have the right to only have their personal information processed with their consent. Is consent not a requirement for lawful processing?
No, not necessarily. So you may have heard me earlier say that one of the things that is necessary is for there to be a justifiable ground for processing personal information. And consent is one of those justifiable grounds. But there are a whole host of other justifiable grounds that a responsible party could rely on. So, for example, it could say that it needs to process your information in order to comply with a particular law or a contract. It could also process information if it's in the interests of the data subject, or if it's necessary for pursuing the legitimate interests of the responsible party. So this last ground is what the church would often base its processing on, is that it's necessary to process the information to pursue its legitimate purposes. So, for example, the contact information of your members, you need that in order to keep them updated about activities that's going on at the church, and their birthday information you may need in order to encourage fellowship so that people can congratulate each other on their birthdays. So this means that consent is not necessarily required because you can fall back on one of these other justifiable grounds. So I think one of the things is important for your members to understand that they won't necessarily be asked to consent to the processing that goes on. But that being said, there are certain circumstances in which consent will be required. And this is when you're going to process what we call special personal information. So this is a separate category of personal information that deals with, for example, a person's medical history or their race or ethnic origin. And a good example of this is a photograph. So if you see a photo of someone, you can tell their race or ethnic origin from that photograph, which means that the photo itself is actually a category of special personal information. So necessarily you will need consent, but consent doesn't necessarily need to be in writing. So if you are going around taking photos of people in the congregation and they pose for the photo, you can take that as that person actually providing their consent for the church to use that photo within its legitimate activities.
And what about children? We take a lot of photographs of children at
Yes.
activities in the church.
Neville, that's a great question. So special personal information is a special category that gets special attention, but also the information of children also has special protection. And what POPI says is generally there's a prohibition against processing any personal information about children unless special circumstances exist. And that might be that the parent or guardian has provided consent to processing the information about their children, or the information has been made public by the child, again, with the consent of their parent or guardian. So for example, your Sunday school activities, if you have a member of the congregation who comes and signs their child up and voluntarily says, this is my child's name and birthday, this is where they go to school, you can take that as the parent providing consent for you to then use that information about the child in line with the Sunday school activities.
So it's not necessarily required that they should give it in writing, that I, so-and-so, give consent that you may use. Is that not necessary?
No. So it's always great if you have a form for the parent to sign that explicitly says that I hereby give consent, and you may wish to do that, but you can also just take it from the fact that they are voluntarily giving you the information and that they know that it's being used for your Sunday school activities. You can take that as consent.
Chloe, practically at all our events and divine services, under normal circumstances, our churches, we would have more than 1,000 members, and we would have photographers present to capture the moments. When a photographer captures a subject, is consent required from that particular subject within a group of, say, for instance, a block of 500 people?
Yes, Neville. So as I mentioned earlier, that consent could be provided by actually posing for the photograph. So I think what's important for you to do is make your members aware that you will be taking photos at a particular activity. And if they do not wish to be in any of those photographs, they can simply step out of the picture. But if they stand with a group and pose, you can take that as consent.
Okay. So one would think that you should have a notice up that say that photos will be taken at this event, and if you have any objection to your photo being taken, please consult or please speak with this person or that person.
Exactly.
Okay,
Perfect.
That's quite interesting. We also take video recordings of our choirs in the congregation during the divine service, at music concerts, etc. Does that also apply to occasions like that?
Yes. So if you had a notice up at those events to make it clear to members and to choir members that they will be recorded, then that would be sufficient. And you would say that by attending this service, you know that you're being recorded and you consent to that recording.
So you say this act becomes enforceable as from the 1st of July 2021.
That's correct.
What else is there that our members should know about POPI?
Sure, Neville. So I think the main thing is just for your members to know that this act does exist. It's coming into effect on 1 July 2021, and that they have certain rights under the act. But what's also important is for your members to understand that in addition to rights, they also have certain duties, and they have a role to play in assisting the church in complying with the act. So, for example, they need to make sure that all of the information they provide to the church is kept up to date. If their contact details change or they move, they should inform the church to make sure that their records are always accurate. The other thing that they should do is to speak up. So if they feel that information is not being processed correctly in line with POPI, they should inform the church. Or if they think that there's been unauthorized access to information or it's been sent out to people who shouldn't have access, they should also notify the church about that. Thirdly, by virtue of being members of the church in a particular congregation, your members will receive information about other members. So for example, in bulletins or notices, you may have that birthday information, Or it may be that someone has undergone an operation, and that's health information because the church is encouraging fellow members to pray for that person. What's important to understand is that it is perfectly acceptable to share that information with fellow church members, but it is very important for members not to disclose that to third parties. And that would include even things like sharing the information on social media, for example. And it's important that if you are handing out physical notices, that members are aware that they should discard those notices safely. And then finally, I would just encourage your members, if they have any questions, to contact the church's information officer.
It's so great to know that, when these laws become enforceable, that the church will be complying to the laws and the regulations of what is required of us. Thank you very much, Chloe, for your time and for coming out to us and for guiding us on the way forward.
Thanks, Neville.
I'm sure you found that, as I have, very interesting, and the next steps for the church will be to notify members of the personal information that the church holds about you, as well as the purpose for processing this information. In certain circumstances, you might be requested to provide your consent to process your information. When it comes to recorded divine services where you might be present, you may see signs up at the physical entrance informing you about any recordings. Please read these notices carefully. By attending these services, your consent to such recordings will be deemed to have been given. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us on info@nac-sa.org.za. From me, Neville, and Chloe, thank you very much for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.